Hey friends, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle, serving as president of Stadia Church Planting, where our vision is for every child on the planet to have a church. We do that by helping you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. Well, I recently reconnected with a friend of mine, Gary Thomas, author, speaker, amazing church leader. Gary has written more than 20 books. You know them, so many of them. One of his most well-known, Sacred Marriage, Sacred Pathways. There's just all kinds. My wife and I just recently went through his video curriculum on Cherish that has to do with marriage. And so much rises and falls on the health of our marriage. So in this episode, we're going to talk about relationships, how to cherish one another, and diving deep into what it means to have a healthy marriage as we lead, as we plant churches, as we multiply. So welcome Gary Thomas to the Church Planting Podcast. Well, I couldn't be more excited about this episode of the Church Planting Podcast because I have a dear friend, and I don't think he even knows this, but an oftentimes mentor to me personally and to my wife and I in our marriage, Mr. Gary Thomas with us. Gary, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast.
Thank you, Greg. Great to reconnect.
Gary, my wife and I were, I guess this probably would have been about literally 12 months ago to right now. We were at a pretty dry place in our marriage. My mom had died 2 months prior. I had some work stuff going on. We were just life was happening as it does. And, we were able to take a week away, just my wife and I. Our sophomore son stayed home, and not we had him cared for, but we went away. And one of the things we did on that week away together is we got your Cherish video series, and each day we would watch an episode of that. And they're not long. I want to say they were like 30 minutes in length, something like that. But afterwards we discussed them, and it refilled our tank. So thank you for that. And it was after that I kind of went, man, I wonder if Garrett'd be willing to come on the Church Planting Podcast, because I'd love for people, everybody go out and get Cherish, the video series, first of all, because it's going to bless your marriage. And it's easy. You guys just watch it together and then you can talk about it afterwards. But Gary, are there trends you're seeing in marriage? I mean, we've got church planters, church leaders right now. What's going on in the marriage world from your perspective right now?
Well, I think, Greg, what you described with your wife is normal for people who are in ministry, because we're not living in a world that's kind or affectionate. There's spiritual warfare, which I think is very real when people are in ministry. There's just the normal flow of our emotions. There's physically, we get tired, we get distracted. There's a fact, according to James 3:2, we all stumble in many ways, so we've got our sin. I wrote the book Cherish and then created the video Cherish, recognizing that if I didn't raise the bar to cherish, my marriage is probably going to slowly devolve and erode and go down, because I don't think we live on an even keel. I think we're married on a slope. We're either climbing up toward cherishing our spouse or slipping back toward contempt. And it's a challenge I believe God gave me some years ago to remember the marriage vows I promised to love and to cherish until death do us part. And for me, it was just, at the time, I thought our marriage was already pretty good. I don't know that my wife or I had any complaints, but for me, it was like raising the bar. Instead of just loving my wife, sacrifice, commitment, loyalty, hanging in there, to cherishing, where I'm not focused on my responsibilities, but on the excellence and beauty. And I use beauty in a broad sense, not just looks, of my spouse. I was shocked what it did for our marriage. I kind of likened it to, I love to run Roger Bannister being the first man to break 4 minutes in a mile. And then right after he did, 2 months later, 2 other people had done it.
Right.
Because of that, raising the bar really changes the approach that we have. Before then, some people thought it wasn't possible. And so I just found in our marriages, especially for people in ministry, I think we have to aspire to more than love. I think we should aspire to love and to cherish.
Okay, so let's talk about Cherish for a few because here's the deal in your book Cherish and in the video series we watched. I mean, Julie and I were just my wife and I were just talking about this recently. The fact that so many husbands, when you ask them, "Does your wife love you?" they say yes, but then when you ask them, Does your wife like you?" Almost all of them say no. And I'm not sure. I think it's probably the inverse was probably true as well when it comes to husbands and wives. Talk about that a little bit because that's an awful feeling, right? To be with someone,
Yeah.
go, yeah, I'm committed in love, but I really don't like them, and
Well,
that's
it
hard to
creates a whole
cherish
different
thing.
it creates an entirely different dynamic in marriage. In fact, I mentioned, I don't know if it's in the series, I know it's in the book, a pastor who had 7 male elders from his church, and he asked them, "How many of your wives love you?" They all raised their hands. "How many of your wives like you?" Every hand went down. I think part of that is they said, "No man's a hero to his valet or valet," depending
Yeah.
on whether you're in Great Britain or the United States. And so when you're living with somebody day in and day out, if you're not mentally making that shift to cherish, I think you do tend to slide back into contempt. It's not just submission. Let me give an example here. My wife and I were at the wedding of a couple thoroughly in love. They adored each other. They did all the things you want a couple to do on their wedding day. 15 years later, we're at a big dinner, 10, 15 people around a large table. And the guy is very much an introvert. So after a while, I'm just trying to draw him in, which is, trying to be polite, draw him in. And somebody said something, I thought he might have an opinion. And I said to him, "Well, don't chefs think such and such?" Before he could answer, his wife breaks in and goes, "He's not a chef. He's a cook."
Oh,
The husband's understandably offended. He goes, "Honey, he can call me a chef." She goes, "No, he can't. Chefs prepare things. You just heat things up." Now, Greg, what he does, he works at a nursing home. He's in charge of 200 residents, 3 daily meals. And nursing homes do cut budgets. Some meals do get heated up, but he tries. He knows this is the high point of their day for a lot of them. But he has to work with the budget. And what hit me was, why was she so afraid that I would give her husband respect that she thought he didn't deserve?
right.
I'm just saying, as a believer, I go back to James 127, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this: look after orphans and widows in their distress. He's living out street level gospel. He's doing what God calls him to do. You could respect that. Why wouldn't she be praying, "God, just as you fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes, give my husband the ability to feed all of these residents, often forgotten as a demographic, to give them not just good nourishment, but enjoyment and pleasure in their eating." But it's that same contempt. She knew what he did when she married him. Why did she have contempt for him now? And as an objective person, I don't know why you would ever have contempt for somebody who's head of 200 residents getting fed in a nursing home. And that's why I think it's so important to say I want to raise the bar from just loving my spouse to cherishing my spouse.
Okay, so give us some practical. I mean, that one, because that's, one of my love languages is encouragement. So for me with Julie, man, I mean, that was like, that's just painful for me to even hear that story because I know it would be devastating to me. Um, and so give us some practical things. What does it mean for, all those listening right now to say, you know what, I do want to cherish my spouse. I'm not sure I know how to do it.
Well, it begins, and we were talking about this before we started recording, Greg. It begins with, I think, one of the most transformative verses in the Bible, Romans 12, to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Christian transformation begins when we think differently. And so if I want to transform my marriage, I've got to think about my spouse differently. And so I thankful to God. The first image of marriage in the Bible is a great place for us to go back to: Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And for a brief period of time, Eve was literally the only woman in the world. There was no one that Adam could compare her to. He couldn't say, "Well, boy, her hair is really thick, but she's not as funny as this one or not as intelligent as that one. All Adam knew was this is what a woman is, and this is what a woman is supposed to be. He received her and he could appreciate her because it's comparison that usually leads to contempt. Same thing for Eve. Adam was literally the only man in the world. She couldn't think, well, man, he's smart, but he's not as athletic or strong as this one. He can't hold a conversation, wouldn't know an emotion if it bit him on the nose till he bled. All those things. She couldn't discount him by comparing him to other husbands. So when we get married, I think we need to make a commitment to contentment. I've chosen you. And so now the comparisons are over. There's no point in comparing them. You are my Eve, or for women, you are my Adam, the only woman, the only man in the world. I'm not going to compare you to anyone. I'm going to receive you as the right one for me. I love to read the Christian classics, and one of the authors had a great example of where every creature shows that it's not complete because God is the only complete being. The two examples would be birds. Peacocks are often seen as the most beautiful bird in the world, but if you've ever heard a peacock's voice, I mean, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard, just off. Then you look at a blackbird, it's monochromatic, one color, not that great to look at, but it opens up its voice and it's heaven. So if you marry a peacock, you don't expect it to be a blackbird. If you marry a blackbird, you don't expect it to be a peacock. He also uses trees. If you want to eat, you go to an orchard where there are fruit trees, and then you can get something good to eat. If you want to build a house, you don't go to an orchard, you go to the forest. You get lumber trees. Can't eat anything off lumber trees, but you can build a nice house. So if you marry a fruit tree, you don't compare it to the trees of the forest. If you marry a tree from the orchard, you accept that not any spouse is everything. And here's what's so key, Greg. Cherishing begins when I accept my spouse as they are instead of compare them with what they're not. And so I just have to, we often think of faithfulness as sexual faithfulness. I'm not going to imagine physical intimacy with someone else. I want the same mental faithfulness with my wife as far as not just physical appearance, personality, pious living, sense of humor, intellect, all of those things. Because cherish has to begin with something that's real. I'm thankful for what you are, for what you have, and what you bring. And I'm done with comparisons that undercut you because of what you're not.
And cherishing, Gary, plays out in the way I treat my spouse. If I really cherish her, then there's a certain way that I'm going to treat her at home, when nobody's around, just her and I, and also in front of people, like your friend so poorly did, in the wedding session. And often, what people see in public, it can be a reflection of what's going on in our house. But sometimes there's a facade going on. Let's talk about that facade, because this whole idea of social media presenting something that's not really true. And sometimes in our marriage, we project to others something that's not true. Talk about the role of authenticity in our marriage and having a safe place to work on our marriage. What would you talk about? Like, should our planters, should our church leaders be going to a therapist? Should they have close friends where they can be authentic and talk about their marriage struggles? What do you recommend in those situations when we're going through tough times?
Well, I'd say yes to both of those.
Okay. Okay.
But here's why, Greg. Especially if you're preaching, you're going to let out where your marriage is. It's just going to come out.
Yeah.
People are watching you to begin with, and then they're hearing you. And sometimes I'll hear people say something that you just wince. Do they realize how that must sound to their spouse or the lack of respect they're showing? I remember being at it was actually an ethnic church, not that this matters, but they had a question and answer time. And then my wife piped in on something and she answered it. afterwards, one of the women came up to me and said, I've been listening to you speak on marriage. She goes, but when your wife started talking, I looked at you and your face lit up. I could see that you adore that woman, that you cherish her, that you respect her. She goes, that said more to me, or as much to me as anything you said. I didn't know people were looking at me. I thought everybody was turned looking at my wife. And then I just got an email. This was a month ago. A couple from our church. I'm teaching pastor at a church just south of Denver, and he said, "Look, I just saw you with your wife. The way that you show affections to her. You guys have been married 39 years. I've just never seen that before. I can't tell you how comforting and healing that is to me." We don't know we're being watched. We're not trying to say, "Okay, we're on now." But for every pastor and spouse out there, you are being watched. And if you're a pastor, you could be watched in the grocery store or the movie theater every bit as much as the church because you don't know if somebody knows who you are. And so I think it's essential that we deal with our stuff. Um, if we don't directly address our frustrations and our disappointments in a healthy way, they tend to leak out of us. And so not only are we not respecting our spouse, frankly, I think for guys, when they don't respect their wife, they start to disrespect women in general.
Ouch.
It doesn't color the particular relationship exclusively. It changes the way they treat women in general. If they've got bitterness, resentment, and whatnot. On the other hand, it can set you up for an affair and whatnot. I just think it's dangerous and foolish to not tend to your marriage, particularly if you're in marriage, because here's what I've said to a group of pastors before. It is a trap to work harder on on your sermons than you do on your marriage. Satan is salivating. Yeah, I could let him preach 3 years of great sermons. One stupid night in a hotel will undercut everything he said and blow up the church.
Okay, let's go there. Let's go there because that's man, I to this day, Gary, one of my big goals in life is to finish well. And that
Yes.
doesn't just mean in my work situation. I want to finish well in my marriage. I want my children to have to go. Mom and dad set a great example for what it means for a husband and wife to love one another and represent the church. And so I've thought a lot about, okay, Julie and I will be married 31 years this fall. And we've worked really hard at our marriage. And a lot of that goes back, Gary, to when we first read Sacred Marriage together, which I personally think is one of your most important books. Though many others have impacted my life, but and you need to go out and buy Sacred Marriage if you haven't bought that and read that yet or listened to it because it's an amazing, amazing read. But let's talk about the falls we're seeing in the traps. So a lot of there's a lot going on these days in the workplace and stuff. It used to be the Billy Graham rule and rule of life, and you never get in an elevator with just another person of the opposite sex. Never drive with a single person of the opposite sex. Don't have lunch with a single. There were all these rules, and those have softened over the years, and probably some of them for the better, I think, as women are more empowered in church leadership and stuff, and we're doing more mentoring. But talk about how do we affair proof our marriage? I mean, how do we put the appropriate boundaries in place to make sure those boundaries don't get crossed?
Well, I always think the best defense is a good offense. If I'm really growing to cherish my wife, that's from Cherish, to serve and love and be faithful to my wife, that's the message of sacred marriage. I don't have a lot of time left over to even consider affair. And my heart is so occupied with serving and cherishing my wife. There's not much left over for someone else. Now that's a simplistic answer, but I do think that's the place I want to go first. Um, are you getting together for fun times? Are you talking and connecting spiritually? My wife loves it with me being a teaching pastor because she never wants to teach. She's always got sermon series ideas.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we did two of them last year. I think we're going to do two coming up this next year. And so there's that sense of spiritual camaraderie where I think you let your spouse in. That's great. And I would say even physical intimacy. You want your marriage to be sparking on all of those levels. And I just think, frankly, you're much less susceptible then to something like an affair.
Okay, Gary, let's talk about it from the preaching role though, because we're talking to a lot of leaders right now. So I want you to think about this really practically. Like one of the things, I don't know if this was good or not, but I think it worked. Um, is I would probably every 2 years when I was senior pastor of River Tree, from the pulpit, I'm teaching on marriage or whatever. I'm on a passage and we're dealing with something from Proverbs or something. And I would say from the front, I love my wife so dearly and stuff. And, one of the things that I do to protect our marriage is if I ever feel like there's something inappropriate going on with a female here from the church, or, I feel like someone's flirted with me or just asked me something was wrong. I just want everyone to know that the first person I just go home and tell Julie and just so she knows, and it just kind of diffuses everything. And it's hilarious, Gary, because it's like if there was anything ever, it's like immediately shut down, right? And because people are like, "Oh my gosh, I hope he didn't go home and say something about me to his wife," right? And I don't, nobody maybe even did anything, right? It was one of those practical protective measures that do you have any tips like that for how over the years you've protected yourself and your marriage?
Well, I've given Lisa veto power over any relationship in my life. My first
Well,
goal is for her to feel loved and cherished. If she feels threatened by any other relationship I have, she doesn't even have to explain it. She rarely does that. There
right,
was a
right.
time, maybe a decade ago, I wasn't in Houston. She said, "Yeah, I want you to be careful of her. And if I die, don't marry her." Ah, whatever reason she thought this woman might have, I don't know if she did. So I'm certainly not accusing anybody, but I've talked to other wives when I'm talking with couples. It just astonishes me that men maintain relationships with other women that the wife doesn't feel comfortable with. And I'm like, no, she gets that veto power. I just think that's part of protecting her. A lot of guys get in trouble digitally, Greg. You know this.
Yes.
So I've got the software on my phone, on my iPad, on my computer. When I'm away traveling, my wife knows there's nothing I can look at that she won't know about. So I'm not even having to think about it, because it's going to happen. And then it kind of actually brings comedy of what gets flagged one time. I gave a
Oh
hard
yeah.
time to my friend. One thing that got flagged was a 65-year-old friend of mine preaching on the book of Exodus. I don't know what covenant I thought that was.
That is hilarious. Yeah.
Um,
So
and then another one was my men's Bible
there's a
study.
deep level
You
of
can see all the
granularity.
faces of the guys. It goes, but but it's not so much that I think I'm gonna fall. Not that I don't ever want to act like that's not possible. It's giving my wife the security. She has every password. I'm leaving my iPad all over anyway, and because of that, same thing with Facebook or email. Just because I want her to feel safe, and this is the key, Greg. A safe wife is a wife that can be intimate with her husband. I'm not just speaking of physical intimacy, but I've certainly
I know. Yep, yep, yep.
else for that. If she doesn't feel safe and if she doesn't feel secure, that's like a cancer on the relationship. So I want to say to guys, look, if you're frustrated in your marriage, especially if you're a pastor, just remember there is no other option for you. You're going to blow up your ministry. You're going to blow up your family unless you just say, I'm going to double down and reconnect with my wife. And I have seen more couples than I can count that all but hated each other. They repented. They started to love each other. They started to cherish each other. Today, they act almost like newlyweds. Um, God can bring two people back together, but you've got to reject any offering, any flirty relationship, any digital fantasy, anything that would keep you from focusing on your marriage. I love what Bob Merritt's, he was pastor up in Minnesota of a major mega church, Eagle Brook. I think it was. Most people will know. He has this line that I just love. The middle is miserable. If you're compromising a little bit in sin, you're miserable. A Christian can't enjoy the sin, but you don't give yourself fully into the enjoyment of the sin because the Spirit convicts you. So you try to have enough, but not too much to get you kicked out. That is a miserable place. I think the same thing is true in marriage. The middle is miserable. You've got a lot of obligations in marriage. You've got a lot of restrictions because of your marriage. And so if you're just sort of faithful, you feel kind of guilty, you feel disconnected from your wife. There's no joy in that. Like there's no peace. In fact, I've seen guys when they're misbehaved, this sounds like a horror show to me, where the wife asks to see their phone or their iPad and they get nervous. I thought, do I want to live with a cop? Do I want to live in fear of being found out? And that's why when you mention these counselors, whatever it is, whether you're hiding wrappers because she's concerned about what you eat, bottles because she's concerned about what you're drinking, or erase websites because she's worried about what you're watching. And just living with that fear of being found out is a miserable place to be. So I would just say, repent before God, bring your wife in every area of your life, live as an open book, and then you can start to build real intimacy.
Gary, we could talk for hours. I hope this is just one of many conversations we'll have on the Church Planting podcast. I'm so grateful for you. Can't wait for your next books to come out. Gary, thanks for being our guest today on the Church Planting podcast.
I'd love to come back anytime, Greg. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast, part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.